Nau mai hoki mai to Branching Out, the podcast series where we discuss Indigenous forests and Indigenous forestry in Aotearoa. Today we're welcoming back Greg Steward to discuss a modern history of Indigenous forestry in New Zealand. So, Greg, my first question here for you, what does Indigenous forestry mean to you as an idea? What does it include?
It's quite an interesting question, and it has quite a number of components to it. Indigenous forest and Indigenous forestry are potentially two different things, and quite radically different things. So Indigenous forests are largely natural forests that occupy the landscape currently. They are often very old in Aotearoa's timeframes, as certain species had the opportunity to occupy a site and other species have found niches and ecosystems have developed. They look quite different to plantation forests, and they operate a little bit differently, not necessarily hugely differently, but they do operate somewhat differently to what would be an Indigenous plantation forest. So Indigenous forestry in itself is probably, I guess, best described as the management of a forest or the establishment of species for particular purposes. Whereas an Indigenous forest is something that has just occupied the landscape as opportunities, seed sources, climate, disturbance, seed dispersal mechanisms have allowed. So they are slightly different, but not necessarily that obvious to the untrained eye looking from the outside. And we've seen examples of that in Northland where people have admired what they thought were natural stands of tōtara and natural stands of Kauri. And then when they've had the opportunity to go inside those stands and seen rows and rows and rows, obviously of planted trees, they've realised that it wasn't quite what they thought it was, but still they admired it for what it was.
So, we've got Indigenous forests, forestry, plantations. In your view, is this different from ngahere? What does ngahere mean to you?
Ngahere to me means the old forests, those that sometimes existed prior to any human settlement of these islands. The likes of the old Kauri forests, the small remnants of those that still exist around Waipawa and Puketi and Omahuta and places in far north. Some of the beech forests of the west coast of the South Island that cover a great extent of the landscape, but have been there for hundreds of years. The old podocarp forests of the central North Island, Puriora, Tivoi, the Turueras, those sorts to me are what I guess represent the old ngahere. Yes, they have been modified through the introduction largely of browsing mammals and rats, stoats and things that affect bird life significantly. But forestry is quite different. The old growth forests tend to be in higher altitude sites these days. The flat land, the lower altitude site is now in pasture or exotic forests or other land uses, increasingly under housing development these days. But when you look where exotic planted forests are now, some of them started in places that were where old ngahere was. It was removed, new forests were planted. At that stage, they were looking for short rotation, faster growing species. So that's why we ended up with radiata pine as we currently see it. But the potential places for new ngahere, new plantation forests of native species, either in mixtures or as single species, currently is still seen as being high altitude, sort of non-productive landscapes, which I think is a mistake because there are opportunities down on better land where, unsurprisingly, you would get better growth, better performance, better productivity if that was what was desired. But in terms of planting new forests for restoration, then there's lots of places that's occurring already, has occurred in the past, but there's huge opportunity for it for the future, but not just as restoration, but also as potential, adding value to farms and potential alternative revenue streams from those sorts of landscapes.
So, thinking about sort of the more recent history, can you walk us through the history of Indigenous forestry since maybe the Treaty of Waitangi?
You probably have to go back a few steps, even prior to the treaty.
Okay.
The first felling of Kauri, for instance, was 1773, I think it was, by French sailors. Didn't go well for them. Broke some tapu and paid the consequences for the Boko Mana Whenua. There would have been trees taken out by Captain Cook and some of his sailors for various requirements that they had. But the forest had already been modified by Māori before Europeans arrived and started to look at the forestry opportunities. So the thinking about clearing sites for pā, for settlement, for food production, for identifying landscapes and seeing landscapes. And in those days, most of that would have been by fire. The east coasts of both islands were quite denuded by the time that Pākehā arrived. And that would have been through fires lit in the dry seasons, probably most likely human-lit fires. Fire is not a huge part of the New Zealand forest ecology through lightning or volcanic activity. So mainly the big clearances would have been through fire by people for various reasons. And once you've lit a fire, it's very hard in some of these forests to put it out again, and particularly if you've got no tools to do that with. So you lit a fire and where it finished was where it finished. And you see the consequences of that in some of the forest types that are out there currently standing in the landscape. Probably to some extent the attitudes might have been the same almost as it was when Europeans arrived, that they saw landscapes just covered in trees that seemed to go forever. So if you lost a few up onto a visible ridgeline, it didn't really matter. It just gave you better access and more usable landscape. So if we think in terms of forestry as an active process rather than just land clearance, then that really started when Europeans arrived, and probably almost immediately. Because you've got to think back to the times when Europeans were sailing, not just the English, but the French were here, others were around in the Pacific and looking for opportunities for Europe. So what was going on in Europe at the time, particularly between England and France in terms of territorial claims and fighting, the English had significantly lost forest resources in both the UK and North America when they lost the colony of what became America. So they were looking for resources, forestry resources for building warships and the like. So when they sailed into the harbours and looked on shore, they saw these vast extents of tall, massive trees, and that just seemed to fit perfectly what they thought they would need for creating warships or repairing ships as they sailed around the islands. So initially, I think Cook and his teams identified Kauri, but on the following trips, particularly into the Firth of Thames, around what is currently Thames and the northern Waikato area, they thought they saw what Cook had seen, but in actual fact what they began to harvest was a lot of kahikatea. Very tall, very straight, thought going to be ideal for masts and ship spars and what have you, but unfortunately kahikatea doesn't have a good long-term natural durability, and they wasted a lot of timber. Kahikatea became used for other things in the long term, particularly butter boxes to transport new dairy industry to the UK and to Europe. But people were really looking at what was to them a free-standing resource, something that could be exploited. And I think I use that term exploited quite deliberately. It wasn't just about harvesting or managing, it was about exploiting a resource that was standing there. Some of that was in relationship to the local mana whenua, but often probably not in the European sense of what I see as mine, and something that is unoccupied is obviously not belonging to somebody. They started to develop relationships with those who they thought would provide them access, or they just took access and started to harvest. Obviously, once Kauri had been identified as a really good quality timber, good quality tree, that really took off in a big way. And forestry probably really developed in the Northland, Auckland and around Thames, around Coromandel Peninsula, and as well as some of the offshore islands, particularly Great Barrier Island was harvested from very heavily in the early days. So by the late 1800s, Kauri Forest had already been identified as being at risk from exploitation, both for the timber and also for the gum that was found both in the trees and under the forests. And there was an awful lot of gum. At one stage it was probably almost the same sort of value as gold was being exported. It was used in paint and linoleum and all sorts of odd things, varnishes and what have you, and followed some of the uses that Māori had already found for the gum of Kauri. But as they were harvesting trees, as they were harvesting kauri, they were also harvesting everything else that was around, so the landscape became quite denuded. And if you see some of the old photos from the early 1900s to late 1800s, it's largely a fire landscape, blackened stems, and sometimes forests were just burnt just to clear without actually recovering the timber. And quite large volumes of timber were never ever recovered. I remember reading a settler's handbook from I think it was the 1850s, that described how to clear land in New Zealand for farming, and it suggested that all trees over 3 foot in diameter should be felled. Once that was dry, then they were burnt. Then everything under 3 foot in diameter that was still standing would have been killed by the fire, and then they felled that and then just sowed grass. A lot of that, nothing was produced other than smoke and ash and grasslands. Quite sad sights, and when you read the history and know where some of the forests were and where they disappeared from, the likes of Puipui up north of Whangarei, around the Taurua Peninsula, around Coromandel, had some absolutely stunning kauri forests from records, and a lot of that was just burnt. Some of it was burnt by gum diggers to get access. So when people were trying to protect forest and create legislation in the early days, a lot of that was often ignored. People just wanted to get on with it and create wealth for themselves and others. And if they saw an impediment, was how to get around it. And once the forest was burnt, it was burnt. That was it. It was gone. I guess by the time the late 1800s, early 1900s, we were actually surprisingly in a timber deficit for the requirements of the new colony. And whilst we were exporting high quality native timbers, we were also importing timbers from Australia and I think from North America, possibly some of the islands as well, Pacific Islands, to build the things that we wanted to build. Having exploited and cleared the forests, I've read a number of examples of people saying, we're going to run out, we're going to run out, we're going to run out. And that being not so much ignored, but it was put into the back of the minds because they needed to develop an economy for the new colony to make it sustainable, because the British Parliament, I don't think, was keen on funding it. It had other things it needed to fund, other ventures it was involved in around the world. So we were seen here as being a source of resources to fund those things and a place for people to go and live.
So obviously at some point we moved from natives to exotics. What did that look like?
After a little bit of experimentation with exotic species, we quickly settled on radiata pine, and there are various reasons for that. Primarily the main reason being the speed of growth of radiata pine. And it really intrigues me that, looking back in what I know today, when we first started planting radiata pine, nobody really had any indication of what sort of timeframes it would take to grow. But happily it grew in 25, 30, 35 years and became a usable size tree. But when we think to go back today and say, oh, we should plant kauri or tōtara, and go, oh no, it's going to be hundreds of years, we shouldn't do that. That's silly. In actual fact, we know that they grow much faster than what was thought of then. Because when people were deciding from those early days of forest harvesting in New Zealand that they were applying old tree growth rates to potentially young trees on better landscapes, on different landscapes. So they were kind of trying to add 1 and 1 didn't necessarily equal 2. It was a strange piece of information to come across, just to see how some of these ideas about growth rates of native trees came about in the country, and largely it was based on small samples of old trees that had probably largely stopped growing or growing very slowly on sometimes poor sites.
Oh, okay. So what does our species composition look like now, and how has that changed our landscapes?
So we see today an industry dominated by largely one species. So radiata pine is around about 90% of the New Zealand forest industry at the moment. The other 10% is 90% of that 10% would be made up of the likes of Douglas fir, followed by eucalyptus for some of the paper industry, probably increasingly a little bit more for solid wood. And then the likes of cypress and redwood, which are now starting to become quite popular as future forestry options around the country, particularly on landscapes that are quite erodible. So it's an interesting history made up of exploitation, assumption, quite a lot of greed in places, sometimes short thinking, sometimes no thinking. If you look back into the legislation around the 1850s through to almost the 1900s, there was what they call wasteland acts. So anything that was covered in native forest or as wetland was determined to be a wasteland and could be converted to a productive use. So it wasn't being used by anybody, in quotes unquotes. So often you see large areas of Southland were cleared when they were doing harvesting of harakeke for fibre, and there was a huge export industry around harakeke. A lot of those lands were drained and turned into farmland, and now some of it gone into forested land. The same around the Waikato. A lot of that was drained. A lot of that was called wasteland, swampland, wetlands. Now those sorts of places we're trying to protect them, trying to expand them. But that's a history of around the world. And it's not just a history particular to New Zealand and not just a history for the Pacific or the South Pacific. It happens virtually everywhere that people moved to. When you needed somewhere to live and you needed resources to live with or live by, you used the stuff that was around you. And when that was gone, you had to think or find something else.
I remember sort of driving through Foxton and hearing a bit about the wetland history over there and that it's all drying up, and I can see that there's different conservation groups trying to work towards restoring it. And there are people that say that it can never be restored. It can never go back to what it was. It can only sort of move forward. But I guess, when you're talking about that legislation around the wasteland, or I guess talking about that legislation around so-called wasteland, I guess that sort of seems to be a turning point or a really important part of that history. So, Greg, you mentioned earlier that the French had tried to, I guess, come over and chop down some trees. I've heard a few theories about what would have happened if the French ended up colonising New Zealand or settling in New Zealand over the English. What's your opinion around that?
There was a report written by a gentleman named Sir David Hutchinson around 1918, 1919, and he did a survey for the then Lands Department or the Government Department about the potential of Kauri forestry. He did a very extensive survey and economic assessment of Kauri as a potential future resource, and he was quite favourable. But what he was proposing was some intensive and extensive management of forests rather than their wholesale clear felling and conversion to other land uses. And within that, he made a comment about the differences in the way different European nations managed their forests. And one of those was that the French tended to have a longer time view of forestry and had suggested that some of their management or long-term management structures would suit New Zealand native forest, and particularly the growing of Kauri as a forestry species. He thought that would have been quite successful. His opinion was that if the French had colonised New Zealand, it's more than likely we would have more native forest now than what we do currently, and certainly more lowland forest than we do. At the moment, we've probably lost 90-95% of our lowland forests, the easy accessible forests. So they would have been seen as good quality growing lands, and those would have been places probably targeted by those who saw the opportunity of growing Kauri and other native species. So the French certainly had and do have a different view, so do the Germans, of long-term forestry options and opportunities. So there's more than one way of managing forests, and we certainly have not explored all of them. I remember reading a book by Steward, who suggested that New Zealand doesn't have a history of forestry, we have a history of cutting trees down. I thought that was quite an interesting comment to make in the view of some of our very bare landscapes.
So then I guess if the French had been the ones to settle, then we might be speaking French right now and we might have bigger forests and maybe a more active Indigenous forestry platform.
Well, if I think to New Caledonia, I had the opportunity to go over there and look at some of the work that they do with species that are related to New Zealand Kauri. They have 5 agathis species and I think it's 13 Araucaria species, which are very closely related to New Zealand Kauri. And they plant those in forestry plantations. So I had the opportunity of going over to New Caledonia and looking at some of the forestry that was being attempted over there. So they'd followed a similar pathway to some extent, and they'd concentrated for a long time on some of the Caribbean pinus species, and they had started an industry around those. But they were also looking to expand into some of their own species, and New Caledonia is quite a hot spot for Araucariaceae, of which Agathis, the New Zealand Kauri, is part of. They have 5 native Kauri species over there. They have now active programs in planting 2 species of Kauri and 3 species of Araucarias in plantations for future timber production. One of those Araucarias, Araucaria columnaris, is quite a significant cultural species to the Kanak people, as I found out over there. It's used as a street tree, it's used as a memorial tree, but now under active management, it's also going to form part of their economic development for the island, and particularly in areas where the nickel mining has absolutely devastated the landscape in places. So again, it's sort of got a bit of a history like New Zealand, full of resources, exploited, but somebody has seen the potential future by, it's not reinventing the past, but bringing back some of the species that were present and also recognising their economic opportunity that goes with them.
I guess thinking about that modern history of forestry in New Zealand, when did we stop chopping down big trees? Or have we stopped chopping down big trees?
If I'm a private landowner and I happen to own a patch of mature native bush that contains podocarps, Rimu, Totara, Kahakatea, Matai, or Kauri, or from the South Island perhaps a beech, I can apply for a permit to harvest trees on what's called sustainable forest management principles. I've got to apply to Urarako for a permit. The forest is then assessed as to the species composition and to the potential standing volume, and then I'm either permitted to take a certain small percentage of that forest, or I'm restricted to one particular species, or I may be restricted from doing any harvesting at all. So in terms of cutting down large mature native trees, that can still be done, but at the moment it's only on private land. I think the last harvesting from Crown land would have been back in the late 1980s, early 1990s. There have been some 1 or 2 odd harvests. There was the harvest of windblown trees in the South Island after one of the big storms went through, and there was seen as an opportunity for West Coast economy development. And I think there are permitted every so often there's the opportunity for cultural purposes for some harvesting, for particularly for carving, for waka, for ceremonial.
If we're thinking about the history that we've just gone over, if you could go back in time and change any one of those events or decisions, what would it be and why?
If I was going to go back, I had the opportunity to go back, it would be to try and encourage people to really see the value in standing trees. You can't just keep cutting things down or digging holes and pulling things out and expect it to go on forever. That's, what do they say, if you keep doing the same thing and expect a different result, that's a definition of madness. And to some extent, that's kind of what we were doing back in the days. We were mad drunk on 3 resources, and that's what we saw. I guess I would go back and try and encourage people to actually see what it is that's standing in front of them, to realise that the resource is finite, and to try and get people to realise that there was as often as much value in the tree standing there as there was in cutting it down. And what do we see today? We see rivers full of mud and debris and destroying infrastructure and what have you. Some of that may still have occurred, even if trees had been there, but may not have been as bad as it was. But some of that, if I was going to be able to encourage people to see the value of standing trees, it would have to have been by proving that native trees could grow faster than what the perception was. We weren't going to have to wait the hundreds or thousands of years to have another harvest from these trees.
It's hard because you go back and try and convince them of the value of natives, and we're still trying to do the same thing today. And they say the best time to plant a tree is 100 years ago, the second best time is today. And we're still trying to convince decision makers that it's a worthwhile investment.
The problem that I see is that the industry, the forest industry, which is largely an exotic species industry, has lost vastly most of the knowledge that adhered around Indigenous species, what they could be used for, what they were good for, where they might grow, how possibly to manage them. A lot of that is gone. So today, if I was to show an industry person a stand of Kauri, for instance, and say, oh, can you see the economic opportunity there? To some extent, I might be surprised if they recognise the species that I was showing them, let alone what economic opportunity there might be as a person who should be interested in growing trees.
Well, again, Greg, you've left us with many things to ponder in there. Once again, thank you to our guest of honour, Greg Steward, and thank you to our listeners for joining us on this week's episode of Branching Out, the podcast series where we explore the world of Indigenous forests and Indigenous forestry in Aotearoa. Don't forget to join us next time. Mauri ora.